The contemporary significance of Baran and Sweezy's notion of monopolistic capitalism, chapter 19, in the text Post-Keynesian Essays from Down Under, volume 1, Essays on Keynes, Harrod and Kalecki of 2016. Yes, an Australian point of view, needless to say. Joseph Halevi is one of the editors of this particular article. I'll skip the abstract and go to the overview. 19.1, an overview. This essay will discuss the main contributions of Paul Baran, Paul Sweezy, and Harry Magdoff in the light of and in relation to modern macroeconomic analysis. The focus of the paper is therefore on their interpretations of the dynamics of capitalism. These interpretations, while using concepts which can be found in the main body of macroeconomic theory, are cast in an altogether different framework. The extensive use these authors make of Keynesian notions is not aimed at identifying full employment conditions consistent with equilibrium in the product market, labor market, and money market, so as then to proceed to derive the right mix of fiscal and monetary policies. That's kind of the whole Keynesian thing. Rather, the Frastellung of the monthly review, the journal monthly review group, does not allow for the transformation of economic concepts into a set of levers to tinker with in order to achieve results defined independently of the modus operandi of the economic system under scrutiny. If we were to limit ourselves to tinkering theory, there would be no room for contributions like those of the authors we have elected to discuss. Indeed, a Marxist would have nothing to add, for example, to Frank Hahn's critique of monetarism based exclusively on the obvious observation that monetarists arbitrarily extend to the real world the postulates of general equilibrium and omit the very restrictive conditions by which competitive equilibrium can be obtained. And you would be perhaps spared of a discussion of the adjustment of the present economy. The description and the analysis of the modus operandi of contemporary capitalism prior to any policy considerations is at the center of the works of Baran, Magdoff, and Sweezy. The emphasis that in recent times the editors of the Journal Monthly Review, that is Magdoff and Sweezy, have been putting on Keynes as a critic of capitalism derives from the view that in Keynes there exists a relationship between the absence in a capitalist economy of a built-in tendency to full employment and the need for radical social reforms necessary to maintain full employment. And the crux of the article will be to talk about, well, what is, we know that there's constant dynamic change in employment. And so so that as a proxy, we always talk about full employment when we're actually talking about, 1% or 2%. And so arguing today about 4.2 or whatever, it's still a reasonable number on the one hand. On the other hand, the actual details are more important. Ultimately, the truth is in the details. For example, yesterday the BLS put something out stating that it was strong, and it's hard to claim that it's strong when it in fact is only higher than an already predetermined lower estimate. So in other words, they put a lower bar to deal with it because, after all, we're in a inflation / stagflation kind of area right now, and we will be for a while, unless some people do some stupid things. According to the editors of Monthly Review, MR, many Keynesians vulgarized Keynes's work to the point of turning Keynesianism into a cure-all for the capitalist business cycle. Yet, contrary to the establishment economists, Keynes knew that there were real and deadly serious problems to be dealt with, and he was not afraid to tackle them. Magdoff and Sweezy's reference to Keynes' willingness to contemplate far-reaching reforms aimed at the elimination of incomes out of capital and wealth concerns the last chapter of the general theory, which deals with the social philosophy influencing the work itself. To this chapter, One should add chapter 16, where Keynes discusses the question of how it would be impossible to maintain full employment in a mature economy with abundant capital goods unless conditions were created for investment to be carried out even at an almost zero rate of profit, that is, at marginal efficiency. Now, the obliteration of the rentier capitalist is seen in chapter 16 as a sine qua non for obtaining a monetary economy in which the rate of interest could be set so low, if not at negative values, as to compel capitalists to undertake investment activities at a minimal rate of profit. Now, what kind of economy would that be? It might be a more mixed economy, one with a little bit more socialist leanings, or, as you'll see in this article, the Marxist version of what counts as a perfectly competitive economy, which is very different than the capitalist version of that. So when there's this discussion in the article, you should just be a little careful about what's being discussed. And that idea is that, it is a utopian idea on the one hand. On the other hand, it seems, once you start looking at the details, actually quite manageable. But that would assume that one has reasonable regulatory control over capitalism, and one would only be looking at it in a short-term rather than a long-term thing. There are problems that cannot become the subjects of technocratic exercises in a static framework. Magdoff and Sweezy make the point that Keynes's great achievement was now seen not as a highly original contribution to the understanding of capitalism's basic modus operandi, but as the invention of a set of clever recipes to counteract the ups and downs of the business cycle. To strengthen their point, let us mention a paper by Tobin and Brainerd, which, on its face value, comes close to the analysis developed in chapter 16 of the general theory. Using a static neoclassical model, where in equilibrium, the rate of return on capital is equal to its marginal productivity, Tobin and Brainerd put forward the view that monetary controls, which lower the rate of return on capital, are expansionary, while those raising the rate of return, are deflationary. A list of possible regimes accompanies the given proposition. Now, any reader of the paper is immediately led to think that what matters is the appropriate recipe, and that kind of is the current thing, and very terrible. In fact, when you start looking at policy suggestions, the sort of little tinkering, as it were, and not what might cause enterprise to become, to use Keynes's words, the bubble on a whirlpool of speculation. Nor is the reader induced to ask any questions as to whether and why, in a laissez-faire capitalist system, liquid investment markets have a strong tendency to arise. This liquidity of investment markets is, in Keynes, strongly associated with a system of ownership relations in which ways to hold savings other than for the purchase of investment goods are open to wealth owners. Now, only if markets are so organized as to make capital assets easily transformable into money can the prospect of purchasing a capital asset, that is a capital good, cars or machinery, be rendered attractive vis-a-vis alternative ways, such as hoarding and or lending. So there is some concept here of a kind of liquidity, as it were. In short, casting analytical arguments in terms of policy option has the effect of erasing the critical approach contained in the general theory and of rendering irrelevant all the arguments about the elimination of income out of accumulated wealth and about the logical necessity of the socialization of investment. Yeah, socialists. The role ascribed to Keynes of a critical bourgeois thinker or of a disinterested inquirer by the editors of Monthly Review precludes any reconciliation with the textbook version of Keynesian economics. We can sort of, kick that one to the side of the road. However, in a very concrete sense, the Marxian foundations of the Monthly Review approach help understand the issues raised by Keynes. One aspect of their approach is their emphasis on the distinction between the factors governing the demand for real capital from the supply of money capital. In the writings of Magdoff and Sweezy are to be found a conceptual and factual criticism of the view so common among American economists, as opposed to UK economists, that the stagnationist tendencies of the last decade are due to a low saving ratio and consequently to a shortage of capital. Their critique combines Marx's distinction between money capital and commodity capital with Keynes's causation, whereby investment determines savings. Money capital, they argue, can be plentiful, the interest rate being very low, and investment demand can at the same time be extremely low. As history has shown, this was the case during the Depression. It looked like you could invest, but there was nothing to invest in. And stagnation of the 1930s, where from the standpoint of capitalist finance, there was no shortage of money capital, but there were no significant investment opportunities in sight. By the same token, growing unused capacity is not incompatible, is compatible, therefore, with the shortage of money capital represented by relatively high interest rates. Now, note that both phenomena have nothing to do with the level of savings. It's not about hoarding or whatever. Idle plant and machinery mean that investment can expand only if effective demand at any given interest rate increases sufficiently to reactivate a significant proportion of unutilized equipment. The expansion of investment will automatically generate the necessary saving. But the possibility of cheap money capital in a prolonged depression and of dear money capital amidst growing stagflation reflect the evolution of the contradictory relation between real capital accumulation and capitalist finance. It's sort of pre-2008 kind of. Hence, a quick collapse of the level of effective demand accompanied by a price deflation, as was the case in 1929 to 1932, is likely to produce a cheap money situation of the kind envisaged by Marx in Volume 3 of Capital. By contrast, a progressive slide into stagnation in which it becomes possible to attempt to maintain the flow of profits by means of inflation and debt expansion is likely to produce the opposite result. This is where we're heading. The longer view approach taken by Baran, Sweezy, and Magdoff compels application of analytical thinking to a concrete subject matter, that is, the big picture, that is, the historical development of capitalism. In this context, then, the author's basic acceptance of Keynes's point that, in general, investment is not at the level necessary to employ existing productive forces is absorbed into a framework in which the increasing difficulties in finding investment outlets are linked to the stagnationist orientation of monopolistic capitalism. Now, this is a long way, and it actually agrees with some of the preliminary observations that even Lenin had about monopolistic or monopoly capitalism as a stage of capitalism. Moreover, the consolidation of monopoly capital is not seen independently of the role of public expenditure, nor is it seen separately from the multiplication of financial instruments and institutions, which, far from being viewed as factors increasing the allocative efficiency of financial markets, are considered conducive to the formation of liquid investment markets, which make the capital development of a country to become the byproduct of the activities of a casino. That's Keynes talking about casinos. In the Baran Sweezy Magdoff conception, monopoly capital signals that stage of development where capitalism, once progressive, has become retrograde due to its imminent inability to realize the potential surplus output of the economy. Hence, the growing tendencies towards unproductive, but not necessarily socially useful activities, including the hypertrophic development of the financial superstructure. So, 2008 lurking. These are forms and oh, bloody hell. These are forms and an expression of the slackening of accumulation, which enters in contradiction with the valorization of capital. Slackening of accumulation, which enters in contradiction with the valorization of capital. So, analytically, we're no longer at where Keynes was, on Keynes's plane, but rather on the line of inquiry followed by Michael Kalecki and Joseph Stendhal. It was, and we've heard them referred to before. It was Kalecki who pointed out that excess capacity is a dominant feature of oligopolistic economies. Remember, we talked yesterday a little bit about oligopolistic economies. I'll probably include a diagram, but you can look that up. It's not problematic. We look at perfect or perfected economies, somewhat mixed, somewhat oligopolistic, and the derivation thereby of cartelism, et cetera, and then, of course, monopolies. Stendhal, while proceeding from Kalecki, has in turn argued that the long-run decline in capital accumulation in the United States, which eventually materialized in the Great Depression, stemmed from the strengthening of profit margins at the turn of the century. 1899 to 1900, right? A period regarded as the beginning of what Schumpeter called trustified capitalism. That is, you had, there were trusts and there was eventually antitrust. Perhaps one of the most interesting, albeit neglected, observations made by Stendhal concerns the relation between the effect of oligopolies on accumulation and the rise of joint stock finance. Now we see that, joint stock finance still applies in so many ways in terms of people making money. The problem as discussed by Stendhal will be analyzed at a later section of this paper. It suffices to remark here that Stendhal's theme is central to the argument of the MR, Monthly Review, folks, aimed at showing how continued stagnation fuels the multiplication of financial instruments. See, we're back to 2008 stuff. When monopoly capital is seen as the core of the capitalist economy, and when the core is correctly viewed as constituted by conglomerates, which are fundamentally financial and not production units, there is absolutely no room for the enlightened reformism advocated by Keynes. So in other words, there are things that are imperfect, kinked even, that exist in, that are part of the structure. The structure is not clean in that sense. Thus, while the MR position retains Keynes's analysis of the link between effective demand and investment, as well as the view that a monetary economy which enhances income out of capital and wealth is in the long run incapable of avoiding misery among plenty, the same position sees the roots of the contradictions of modern capitalism and the impact of monopolistic formations on the accumulation of capital. Whereas, remember, yesterday we were talking about teal, and and the same teal thing that was mentioned last night in the People's Forum presentation on imperialism, Lenin's imperialism. For what has been said above, it emerges that the contributions of Baran, Sweezy, and Magdoff take up the issues raised by Marxist thinkers at the turn of the century. A comparison between the MR group and this debate is therefore necessary in order to show the analytic differences between accumulation in a monopolistic economy and in a competitive economy such as that studied by Marx. So the debate is therefore necessary in order to show the analytical differences between accumulation in a monopolistic economy, right, that has monopolistic attributes, and in a competitive economy such as that studied by Marx. Note, of course, that the common propaganda is to say, well, Marx, those Marxists, they want to have a command economy, and nothing is nothing is competitive. Whereas if you look at it from a classical point of view, the assumption is that there's the competition does exist. It may be manifested in a variety of different ways, but animal spirits are still there. 19.2, classical Marxism and the MR group. The Marxist debate at the turn of the century focused on questions concerning the long-run development or breakdown of the capitalist system and the impact of the rise of trusts, remember, trust, antitrust, and cartels. In both cases, Marxist schemes of reproduction were used in their macroeconomic dimension, that is, as an analytical framework for hypotheses about the actual tendencies of capitalistic accumulation. The breakdown controversy has, in my opinion, only historical value because of its deterministic character. More specifically, the attempt to show on the basis of Marx's schemes that the system can be subject to steady accumulation or to economic collapse, anticipates by more than 50 years the discussion about the instability or stability of growth models. There's an entire discourse about this. It's very neoclassical. The difference lies in the fact that in the Marxian debate, the object was the actual process of accumulation, whereas in growth models, the object is purely represented by the properties in the model. So you can see this is already a critique of neoclassical modeling. As Kalecki once remarked, a curious division of labor is taking place in the West. On the one hand, the government was trusted to balance demand and capacity in the short run, while on the other hand, economists would concentrate on steady growth theory, in which the problem of effective demand and the formation of long-run bottlenecks were assumed away. Now, Kalecki's critique is really important because he's looking at the math and he's sort of saying, well, this neoclassical version of it only works because you've already, made a whole bunch of presumptions that you shouldn't really be presuming, let's put it that way. So it looks very clean from a mathematical point of view, but it doesn't match reality as well as it should. The debate over the question of breakdown versus growth remain, however, on deterministic grounds, because many participants try to infer conclusions about the actual tendencies of accumulation using numerical extrapolations of Marxist schemes of expanded reproduction. Tendency of the rate of profit of fall, organic composition of capital, the transformation problem, etc. By contrast, a non-deterministic approach was taken by Lenin, because it's there in some of the readings that we've already done. Rosa Luxemburg, certainly, in her magnum opus on capital accumulation, and also to some extent by Rudolf Hilferding. Hilferding cited last night and in the readings, and already in the readings. And there'll be further discussions of Rudolph's work below. The thinkers did not try to interpret the possible tendencies of the capitalist system by mechanical manipulations of the reproduction schemes. Instead, they attempted to identify the historical configurations to which capitalistic accumulation might lead. The works of Baran Sweezy and Magdoff have to be related, especially to this second group of Marxists. So here's the contrast. There is a kind of orthodox kind of position, and then there is something not so orthodox that looks at these other matters. And are just simply, some people look at Marx in a very deterministic way. Whereas as the capitalist economy grew, you had all these kind of mistakes or errors or crap. You'd think that there could never be a depression, and there was. So, so other Marxists began looking at this and saying, well, what's going to cure this? Is it complete breakdown, chaos, and revolution, or is it something else that we can actually, not to be a reformist about it, but, you can actually get a handle on this? Now, for the purpose of our paper, the analysis will be confined to Hilferding and Luxemburg. It's just a matter of space, needless to say. And they'll get back. We'll get back to Baran Sweezy in a second. In his book, Das Finanzkapital, Finance Capital, Hilferding saw the source of crises in the disproportionalities arising between different branches of production, and not in the emergence of general overproduction. There's this argument about underconsumption and overproduction being the basis for crises, and that doesn't always happen. Other things are part of the crisis, and they're harder to measure because, stuff happens, as they say. Basing his analysis very much on the German phenomenon of the mixed banks, banks which acted not only as lending institutions, but also as managers and controllers of industrial activities. This will have other implications relative to the end of the First World War and the beginning of the Second World War. Hilferding viewed economic activities governed by cartels. The creation of cartels, he argued, had a twofold effect on the dynamics of capitalism. On the one hand, it sharpened economic conflicts, while at the same time it led to a regulation of production. The formation of cartels in different countries would produce a struggle within each country, leading towards the consolidation of one general cartel, ITT, whatever, Krupp, social tensions and class conflicts would, in this view, arise from the economic struggle between different cartels. Hilferding also described in great detail how competition between different cartels could lead to a global military confrontation among capitalist countries. The possibility of a socialist revolution was seen by Hilferding to exist objectively in the class conflicts generated by the economic and eventually military wars caused by cartelization. Now, although cartels during their formative phase give rise to acute class conflicts, Hilferding thought that a fully cartelized economy would be more stable than a competitive one. And this position is shared also by Schumpeter. This is one of the arguments, this is kind of a Peter Thiel quasi-Austrian thing, and shows the unfortunate selectivity or subjectivity of some readers of people like Schumpeter. Anyway, in Hilferding's work, there are many interesting observations which foreshadow much of the themes developed by non-Marxist economists after World War II. In particular, he pointed out that the cartel's ability to regulate production makes the effects of a crisis to be felt especially by the independent competitive producers, therefore, or thereby, furthering the concentration of capital. Now, remember we talked about concentration of capital as Lenin describes it, and this is not that different. A similar argument was put forward by John Kenneth Galbraith some 47 years later. Moreover, Jamie's dad, whatever. Moreover, the concentration of banks which accompanies cartelization is bound to lead to a growing endogenization of money. Concentration of banks and their integration with industrial capital would eliminate, according to Hilferding, the need for commercial credit in favor of bank credit. The process of credit creation would be entirely under the control of banks. Gold, he argued, would be used only for international transactions. The endogenous creation of means of payment would therefore enable the regulation of credit itself, making financial crises more unlikely. Would that could happen? While Hilferding considered the process towards full cartelization to be fraught with titanic clashes between cartels and thus unleashing formidable class conflicts, the theoretical thrust of his argument is that cartelization brings about a regulation of production and credit. During the years of the Weimar Republic, right? Remember, the Weimar Republic exists prior to the, Nazism. Post World War I, the interwar period, etc. Hilferding's and Schumpeter's misconceptions about the alleged regulated stability of trustified capitalism lie in the fact that both looked at the concentration of capital through the prism of absolute monopoly as opposed to a relative monopoly, while neglecting oligopolies altogether. So note that they were just looking at it too simplistically or too dichotomously or in a binary way. And oligopolies are this intermediate form where it is the eversion, let's say, of cartelization, and in reference to a market. Whereas a cartel has a more dominated, more vertical, kind of market structure, more vertical, whatever, less horizontal, whatever. In this way, they waste the important point that in the advanced stage of capitalistic development, money is endogenously created. This is, kind of where MMT is going. In fact, the connection between endogenous money and the development of modern capitalism should be seen as an expression of the capitalist system becoming increasingly demand-determined and not as an expression of its self-regulating power. No such misconceptions arise in, Baran, Magdoff, and Sweezy because their basic unit, that is, they're critiquing the large corporation, is of an oligopolistic kind. This enables them to tie monopoly capital to the issue of the realization of the surplus discussed by Luxemburg. The whole business, and the reason why, 2 weeks ago I was fiddling around with surplus value again, and I'll be back there again soon, is the idea that, how is the surplus developed? How is it manipulated? And is it, the scale issue, et cetera, et cetera. I will start from what I think are the main points. Oh, wait a second. No, this enables the Baran Sweezy book, Monopoly Capital, sketches out the working of oligopolistic firms in a way which is by and large, consistent with a more detailed analysis of Silos Labini's Oligopoly and Technical Progress of 1969. I will start from what I think are the main points made in the second book in the Oligopoly and Technical Progress. The profit margins obtained in oligopolistic industries, that is, an industry with, market concentration in a number of industries, but not necessarily cartelized, result from a pricing process in which the size of the market plays a far more important role than the elasticity of demand. So, we're just switching the variables a little. The main reason for this is that oligopolies arise out of technological discontinuities and indivisibilities in production. Now, this is going to continue on further, but let me just stop there. Technological discontinuities and indivisibilities are really important, and you can begin to see this in the current state. That is, only certain countries, Taiwan using Dutch machine equipment, dominates a segment of the custom chip production market, only because there are certain indivisibilities. They have, for X number of reasons, it takes a lot of stuff to do custom chips, whereas regular chips or, more conventional processed chips are more easily produced, and, you can offshore production and et cetera, et cetera. And so there are discontinuities, technological discontinuities. You need, bigger machines, better machines, et cetera. And you can't divide them up. You can't scale it down, et cetera, et cetera. These indivisibilities prevent oligopolistic firms from conquering the entire space of the competitive units. It follows then, in other words, there's sort of comparative advantage. Some companies, they do whatever better and they fit into the process better there. And, they don't have many competitors, but they have a few. And then there's this kind of grouping of things going on that dominate certain types of production. It follows then that oligopolies are not really interested in absolute monopolization. That's sort of what Thiel is talking about. Oh, monopolies are good, blah, blah, blah. That assumes that you control the entire business, and rarer these days. Although, if you go back and look at, IBM dominated the computer market for a long time. I know there's other companies, DEC and blah, blah, blah. But, there are reasons why it did. For example, patent control of the Hollerith card and blah, 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 blah. And this means that the elasticity of demand is not relevant either. So the point is, you don't have to worry about an elasticity of demand. It's kind of more solid, let's put it that way. It's more inelastic. Oligopolies face, so to speak, a finite demand in a dynamic sense. That is, structural discontinuities do not allow for the expansion of investment unless the market has grown sufficiently to justify the construction of new plants of a technologically determined size. This is the fallacy of the Trump tariff policy in terms of revitalizing the American manufacturing base. We can see that the importance of oligopoly theory for a Marxist understanding of modern capitalism is deeper than many Marxists think. It outlines the structural outcomes of the process envisaged by Marx when he spoke of the rise of joint stock companies, but the consolidation of oligopolistic formations changes the dynamics of accumulation itself. Now, perhaps the line of inquiry should no longer center on the issue of growth and crisis, but rather on stagnation, decline, and the possible limits of counteracting tendencies, not just in the economic, but also in the institutional sphere. In other words, you see an expansion of perspectives, whereas, prior to this, there was a tendency, as I suggested, to look at it in more absolute terms. Oligopoly theory, especially in the Silos Labini version of it, connects the forces of stagnation with the discontinuities of large-scale production. By discontinuity, it is meant here that only firms of a certain size can install the fixed capital embodying production techniques necessary to obtain scale economies. Concentration creates the conditions for large firms to arise, and a structural discontinuity emerges because smaller firms are not in a position to undertake the required capital investment. Fixed capital appears, therefore, as a strategic factor in a concentrated economy, a control variable which determines also the nature of technical change. The theory also postulates that in the absence of an increase in effective demand greater than the increase in the total costs, which will be brought about by a given size of new fixed capital, oligopolistic firms will tend to introduce innovations aimed at lowering the variable costs, especially labor costs, right? The labor savings bias of innovations is also linked to the role of fixed capital and unused capacity as a barrier to entry and as a weapon of deterrence against other oligopolists. So, I was going to get into a tedious example of what kind of things that you need. You need certain types of equipment to build big artillery, let's put it that way. And not everybody has a whatever machine that will make big enough barrels for, and particularly replacement barrels for your, artillery or whatever. And that the fact that they don't have that capacity is a barrier to entry for other companies to want to compete at that kind of level. For example, in the market for replacement barrels. And lest you think that's unimportant, you don't fire too many and that many rounds in artillery before the barrel starts wearing out and it affects accuracy, among other things, and you got to replace the damn barrel. And early on in the Ukrainian-Russian war, there was an issue about that the Ukrainians had at least a method for replacing barrels, whereas Russians weren't paying quite as much attention to it, which did affect, they tended to have more artillery rather than accurate artillery. Anyway, although wage increases following a rise in productivity will counterbalance the decline in employment as far as the demand for consumption goods is concerned, the economy will still move towards stagnation and decline, albeit at a lower speed. For if unemployment rises over time, the bargaining power of workers is likely also to decline. Wages will no longer move apace with productivity, which under oligopoly means that profit margins will rise. So we're at the current place where, some firms are very happy. Capitalists are very happy with, lower wages. And because they're accruing or they're getting bigger profit margins. Now, this doesn't apply across the board, so that's always an issue. At this point, Stendhal's link between higher profit margins and lower accumulation rates caused by and leading to a lower degree of capacity utilization comes into being, and stagnation, cum decline, sets in. The observations about oligopolies and innovations made so far help eliminate some ambiguities contained in monopoly capital. Baran and Sweezy you need to remember that Baran and Sweezy, is it Baran or Sweezy dies, Baran dies early on, and there's some things don't get fully dealt with in monopoly, as some may have read. And they apologize in the introduction for doing more of a sketch as opposed to a fully completed theory, and that's best left to someone else in that particular context, but it's still an important document. In order to show that the oligopolistic corporation generates a weaker inducement to introduce innovations, thereby reducing the scope of investment opportunities, Baran and Sweezy refer to a point made by Joan Robinson. Recall that we read a little bit of Joan Robinson, that for innovations to occur under non-competitive conditions, the rate of interest must be very low indeed. The problem is that in Joan Robinson's framework, and particularly in her book, Accumulation of Capital, there is virtually no room for an analysis of the relation between concentrated oligopoly and the production indivisibilities. It was just, she didn't have an army of graduate students. By contrast, Silas Labini, following an argument put forward by Oscar Lang, shows that innovations also take place under oligopolistic conditions, but they're likely to be of a labor-saving kind, thus accentuating rather than mitigating the tendency towards stagnation. Under these circumstances, the role of the rate of interest is of secondary importance and, in fact, becomes problematic altogether. Baran observed that under mature capitalism, the task faced by managers and policymakers would not be slow adjustments to small changes. The main prerequisite for the applicability of the rules derived from static analysis, but choice among few technological alternatives involving large indivisibilities and fixed coefficients. Now, in the future, I will explain that. This view, in an oligopolistic context, means that investment will be made only if the expansion of demand is large enough to enable the firm to overcome the increase in total costs connected with the indivisibility cited. Hence, if in a normal situation the rate of interest is reduced to very low levels, as Joan Robinson maintains, it will not change the labor-saving character of innovations. On the contrary, it should in fact enhance that labor-saving character. Now, the role of the rate of interest in relation to investment becomes even more ambiguous if one considers two additional factors which are specific to the oligopolistic stage of capitalism. That is, self-financing in the oligopolistic firms and reliance on bank loans in the competitive ones. And number two, the form of allocation of profits. The rate of interest, and therefore the policy of the central bank, primarily affects the borrowing of small firms as opposed to large firms. By contrast, the larger self-financing capabilities of big corporations create the structural conditions for capital markets to become imperfect. That is, it's imperfect in the sense that, there are these inefficient large things that occur. The potential ability to self-finance can be used to obtain loans on a preferential basis so as to maintain the desired degree of liquidity, thereby reducing the impact of what Kalecki called the principle of increasing risk. From the viewpoint of the social economy, the investment and borrowing activities of the corporate sector have to be judged in relation to whether they expand employment or not. It is here that the link between oligopolies and indivisibilities comes back in full force. That is, if demand does not expand by the required amount, oligopolies can use their undistributed profits so as to, number one, invest in the stagnationist sense, described above. Number two, become net lenders. Number three, acquire assets in the stock and bond markets. And without over applying this, but you could see that some of this happens in the subprime way, and the subprime analysis, as articulated by Michael Hudson. All these activities can be beneficial and necessary from the vantage point of the corporation, but they're not where the social economy is concerned. The contradiction between declining real investment opportunities and expanding of financial investments has been one of the main arguments put forward by the Monthly Review Group in recent years. The weakness of investment activity is analyzed in terms consistent with the stagnationist approach of oligopoly theory, but the argument about the growth of the financial sector is tied to the relationship between stagnation, inflation, and indebtedness. That's where we are presently. There's huge, the fiscal policy and $2 trillion added to the national debt, looking at it from a national point of view, which reflects itself downward. And then inflation, stuff costs more now. And there is a kind of stagnation that's built in this as well. And some idiots think that, doing only one or two specific things is going to change that. And it won't. Even though you drag the head of the Fed in every week to yell at them, not going to do any good. This raises a number of analytical problems, although the problems do not invalidate the way in which Magdoff and Sweezy present the issue. The point is that from the connection between oligopoly and stagnation, it's possible to derive a preference for financial over real investment. It is also possible to derive a relation between oligopoly and the rise of the inflationary floor, that is, this whole body of inflationary stuff, and derive it mainly via the non-symmetrical working of prices, that is, raw material and food prices, as well as those of the competitive firms, tend to rise when demand increases. But oligopolies' prices do not fall when demand declines. See, it doesn't clear. It is, however, extremely difficult to build a consistent framework showing the interaction of these three phenomena. You need lots of stuff to get that to work. A partial indication of the possible transition to a state of indebtedness comes from Stendel's analysis of rentier savings generated within the corporate structure. This will be discussed in the fourth section. In the context of the argument discussed here, the main achievement of the works by Baran Sweezy and Magdoff must be seen in their having carried the Marxist themes of the long-run tendencies of capitalistic accumulation into the contemporary setting of oligopolistic capitalism. The causal relations between the productive and financial aspects of the system have yet to be worked out, which means it's necessary to grasp the differentia specifica of accumulation under oligopolistic conditions vis-a-vis accumulation under competitive capitalism. 19.3, competition, monopoly capital, and structural maturity. In two remarkable essays on monopoly and competition from a Marxist perspective, Sweezy made the following points. Number one, with monopoly capital, the notion of a general rate of profits loses its significance. A hierarchy of profit rates sets in instead. And number two, the extraction of surplus value is common to both competitive and to monopolistic capitalism, although with the latter, that is, under monopolistic capitalism, the form of realization of surplus value changes in a substantial way. On one hand, monopolistic corporations must take care of not spoiling the market. On the other hand, the larger volume of profits allows them a more rapid expansion via direct investment and easier financing. So, big is better, but don't screw up the market. The main contradiction becomes that of the increased ability to expand versus the more constrained scope for actual expansion. Two important observations follow from the above. First, the problem of effective demand is far more significant under oligopolistic conditions than under competition. Now, this does not mean that the realization of the surplus produced is impeded by underconsumption. The Monthly Review people, and Sweezy in particular, view the consolidation of monopolistic capitalism in a context of structural maturity. For example, this is a situation where the productive capacity of the capital goods sector is such that the investment priority should no longer be directed towards the formation of the capital goods industry. This means also that the employment capacity at near full utilization of existing capital stock and of related services suffices more or less to absorb the bulk, if not all, of the labor force. In other words, labor stuff is not as important. In the terminology used by Kaldor, we could say that structural maturity defines a situation in which labor, and not capital, is the potentially scarce factor, whereas in terms of Keynes's argument outlined in Chapter 16 of the General Theory, we would say that the abundance of capital goods, which, when achieved, implies little or no income out of capital and wealth, is within a reasonable reach. So the abundance of capital goods is within a reasonable reach. Hence, the basic disease of monopoly capital lies not in crude underconsumption, but in a situation where at anything approaching full employment, the surplus accruing to the propertied classes is far more than they can profitably invest. The key expression here is anything approaching full employment, which means that full capacity output roughly coincides with full employment. Now, second, crises no longer perform the role of solving the contradictions of capitalistic accumulation because their function for restoring the rate of profits and the rate of accumulation is greatly weakened. This is why stagnation acquires significance. To understand this point, we must discuss the question of unused capacity, since it is via the degree of utilization of equipment that the impact of monopoly capital on accumulation and on the role of unemployment, or the reserve army of the unemployed, shows itself most clearly. Now, in the works of Kalecki and Stendel, unused capacity is the norm under oligopoly. They're not running at full capacity. But idle plant and equipment appeared also during the competitive phase of capitalism, especially during crises. So, you have to identify which is which in the circumstance. By competitive phase, now we do not refer to static perfect competition, but to the Marxian and classical notion of competition which allows for the periodic formation of unemployed resources, labor in particular. The primary characteristic of Marxian competition is that there are no major barriers to entry and exits, barriers to entry and exit. Hence, capital stock and investment do not perform any relevant function of protection of profit margins. It's just not complicating the argument, but it can be made complicated. It's just not being made complicated here. A corollary of this notion is that capitalists cannot influence market prices, which are instead determined by what is it determined by? Supply and demand, a view very strongly and correctly maintained by Marx. So Marx assumes this, right? And the way you know that he's doing this, as opposed to kind of the meandering of the volume Capital, volume 1, 2, and 3, wages, price, and profits, the pamphlet kind of describes it better or more succinctly. Let's put it that way. Now, because there are no barriers to entry, those capitalists who have adopted a superior method of production enjoy only temporary exceptional gains, which must, however, be invested as much as possible precisely because market positions cannot be defended by any other means. Now, in Marx's words, competition compels the capitalist to keep constantly extending his capital in order to preserve it. But preserve it he cannot, except by means of progressive accumulation. So there's this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, as it were. The appearance of unused capacity during the competitive phase of capitalism goes hand in hand with a drastic fall in prices, which accompanies every downturn of the cycle. A completely opposite situation characterizes excess capacity under oligopoly. Indeed, idle capital equipment and decline in price signals, what does it signal? It signals bankruptcies and business failures. And to avoid failure, capitalists try to sell as much as they can to meet financial obligations. Now, since they don't influence prices, they administer supply either and are compelled to sell even at a loss. These forced sales play a very significant role in the crisis. This financing aspect of the crisis highlights its competitive character, which affects also the movements in interest rates. Producers, in order to stave off bankruptcy, sell goods against cash and also attempt to borrow money to pay debts. This is a liquidity problem. Hence, the rate of interest reaches its peak during crises, where money is wanted at any cost to meet payments. Under Marxian competition, excess capacity does not have the same macroeconomic effect as under oligopoly. Idle equipment in conjunction with a fall in prices implies exit from the most effective industries, entry in the relatively less effective ones, and with the generalization of the crisis, the destruction of capital. So by comparison, Marxists appear to be more efficient in that particular comparison. However, when barriers to entry and exit exist, a barrier to entry and exit are, these are the things that restrict people entering a market, et cetera. And, there's, the quotas and other kinds of HR kind of determinations at one level, at a labor level, but at market levels, barriers to entry describe the costs of entering a particular production sector. The mechanism, as pointed out by Stendhal, works differently. The undesired amount of unused capacity can be eliminated by not replacing part of the equipment which wears out. Deferred replacement, a type of adjustment which is bound to reflect itself on the demand of capital goods and thus on aggregate investment demand. We obtain, therefore, the following picture. Investment under oligopoly is also made with the aim of strengthening entry barriers by deliberately building excess capacity. This, however, creates the condition for an adjustment mechanism which, when undesired excess capacity emerges, negatively affects aggregate investment demand, thereby perpetuating unwanted spare capacity. So it's ultimately still inefficient. Now, Baran, in his Political Economy of Growth, fully captured the novel dimension of investment as compared to competitive capitalism. He also noted that corporations' ability to control capital stock is an improvement which enters into conflict with the private form of investment, viewed in an oligopolistic economy as demand determined in terms of a rational husbandry of society's resources. The capital preservation policy of the monopolistic firm may be frequently preferable to the excess investment and to the destruction of capital that takes place under competitive conditions. Yet, as is often the case under capitalism, such advance in rationality as is achieved is perverted into its opposite if the monopolistic capital preservation policy contributes to a shrinkage of investment opportunities and leads to a reduction of output, income, and employment. Now, in Monopoly Capital, the book, the same point is reiterated in a manner which implicitly raises the question of whether or not unemployment plays the same role as in Marx's analysis of the reserve army. And, some people overgeneralize the nature of the reserve army as though it were an actual army, as opposed to simply being a category of the underemployed. This is a very important question because for Marx, the reserve army of labor is functionally related to accumulation. It helps restore the rate of profits and the rate of growth via the reduction in wage rates caused by competition between workers. In other words, you're out there wasting resources trying to get you're sending out applications, or you're running around getting interviews or whatever. That's kind of what's going on. Thus, if unemployment no longer plays that role, we should ask ourselves, well, whatever happened to those forces of accumulation? Now, let us quote from the book. In the older theories, and here we include Marxian as well as classical and neoclassical economics, it was normally taken for granted that the economy was operating its plant and equipment at full capacity. Now, this is an important point, isn't it? That the assumption of full capacity as opposed to underused capacity, which does come up under oligopoly. The link between a full capacity economy and unemployment is expressed as follows. In the Marxian economy, in the Marxian theory, unemployment, that is the industrial reserve army or relative surplus population, was assumed to be normal and to play a key role in regulating the wage rate. In the absence of idle plant and equipment, however, the unemployed could not be put to work to produce additional surplus. So there's, it's paradoxical in that sense. By contrast, under monopoly capital, here the normal condition is less than capacity production. The system simply does not generate enough effective demand, to use the Keynesian term, to ensure full utilization of either labor or productive facilities. On the basis of our previous discussion, the Baran Sweezy position can be summarized in the following terms. Under competitive capitalism, it is impossible to hold onto excess capacity because the falling prices will cause a stream of exits and economy-wide bankruptcies. Unemployment will cause, in turn, a decline in wages, creating the conditions for a recovery in the rates of profits and accumulation. Now, if this situation does not obtain in an oligopolistic economy, then the relationship between the growth of output and the share of profits, and between the rate of profits and the share of profits, must be different from that hypothesized in the Marx-Goodwin framework of competitive capitalism. Indeed, the model put forward by Richard Goodwin captures the essence of Marx's notion of cyclical accumulation. Remember, Marx believes in this kind of movement. It's just that he doesn't assume it having certain characteristics and the inequalities that arrive. Since in this model, the share and the rate of profits move in the same direction, and unemployment helps restore the rate of accumulation. At this juncture, Kalecki's definition of the share of profit as expressing the degree of monopoly comes very useful because it's valid only if unused capacity exists. So to put the matter succinctly, Kalecki's degree of monopoly reflects the distributional factors composed by entry barriers and the like. It represents, so to speak, the balance of forces of oligopolistic powers. Unused capacity becomes a structural connotation of the system. So there's this sign of, some factories are not being fully deployed. This was happening before the Ukraine war in the armaments industry in the US. In this context, the share of profit is negatively related to the degree of utilization of equipment, to the growth rate, and to the rate of profits. And there's this huge math thing in the appendix, so don't get crazy. If the rate of capacity utilization were equal to unity, 1, the above negative derivatives would turn out to be positive. That is, the share of profit, the rate of profit, and the rate of growth would rise or fall together, as in the Marxian full capacity economy. Now, we have come to what we believe is the most important implication of this Kalecki, Stendhal, Baran, Sweezy, trying to link all this put together. If an increase in the degree of monopoly, that is the share of the profit, leads to a reduction in the rate of utilization and the rate of growth, then ceteris paribus, everything else equal, unemployment will increase.
The rise in unemployment by weakening the labor organization may subsequently cause wages to grow less than productivity, which under oligopolistic conditions implies an increase in profit margins rather than a proportional fall in prices. That's kind of where we are. People are making profits, and there's no price that's falling, at least at one level of production and consumption. The degree of monopoly will go up further. Utilization rates and the growth of output will drop. Unemployment will expand. Roughly similar results can be obtained even without postulating an initial increase in the degree of monopoly. Now, following a very intelligent paper by Del Monte, on which the appendix with all that math is based, we can assume that the actual degree of monopoly corresponds to a utilization rate generating a growth rate of output below that of the labor force and productivity. So it's inefficient in that particular way. If wages grow along with productivity, the system keeps going on the steady state with a given degree of unused capacity. So there's this gap, right? Unemployment, however, will expand. That is, more people will be, dislocated by this. And it might not be de-skilling. It just might be, deliberate unused capacity. So if unemployment has a negative effect on the dynamics of wages, we are back to the original argument. That is, the degree of monopoly and unused capacity will rise and growth rates will fall. Note, of course, originally we need to have, this shark needs to keep swimming. In all these cases, the reserve army of labor moves more or less apace with reserve production capacity. Unemployment might regulate the wage rate, and especially the wage productivity relations, only to make things worse. So in other words, once it starts, you can see there's this tendency it's not going to get better. It seems, therefore, that in an oligopolistic framework, the relation between the reserve army of labor and accumulation is not as strong as in the Marxian case. So all of this arm waving is dependent on a conception of ultimately of competition, of competitive structure. Unemployment remains a product of capitalist relations. It stems from the stagnationist forces inherent in monopoly capitalism, but it loses any major objective function. Unemployment emerges basically as a social contradiction, and this is the whole reason for Marx, arm waving and etc. The system is built not to be effective or efficient. So there is a kind of utopian goal, you could say, for Marx, but it's not perfection. It's just simply idealized, perhaps, or optimalized in a sense better than capitalism. Kalecki's view that under oligopolistic capitalism, the role of trade unions is to push for a reduction in the markup in order to expand employment, therefore, is correct. Kalecki's talking about reduction in markup. He's looking at the gap between what the thing costs to make and the price that you charge ultimately in the market after you get to Department 2. Our thesis that present-day unemployment would not favor capital accumulation, even if it led to a fall in wages, is not unconnected, therefore it is connected with the other aspect of modern oligopolistic economies, namely that of structural maturity. The Caldorian concept of labor being the potentially scarce factor, a point which was introduced at the beginning of the section, is applicable to a historical context in which productive forces reached an advanced stage of development. In other words, these things don't apply quite so much into lower types of widgets. This applies mainly towards more complicated stuff, electronics, stuff that's not necessarily applicable to a certain level of advancement. In Marxian terms, this means that the production of the means of production, that is the main source of accumulation, can by far outpace the labor resources technically necessary to operate them. And this means a certain biasing towards technology that we see already in Marx. Kaldor has aptly pointed out that labor-saving technical progress cannot be relied upon to ensure the right amount of labor supply. And so this is Kaldor writing in the 60s. In order to prevent the emergence of excess capacity and equipment, the new machines must be so much more labor saving than the aggregate amount of labor required to work the newly installed equipment per unit of time should be no greater than the amount of labor simultaneously released through the disappearance of that part of old equipment which is worn out and has to be scrapped.
Marx says this too. This depends not only on the rate of technical progress, but also on the level of investment activity, and the condition will be all the less likely to be fulfilled the greater the aggregate amount of new equipment produced per unit of time. So, although Sweezy does not tie industrial maturity to the scarcity of labor, his argument becomes clear when cast in this Haldorian term. His observation that when the capital goods sector has been fully built up, economic activity should shift from the accumulators to the consumers becomes stronger when the productive capacity of means of production could turn labor into a scarce factor. Fully automated, right? Luxury communism. But the attainment of this macroeconomic goal is, in the Baran Sweezy framework, impeded by monopoly capital. Large-scale economies and production indivisibilities are the source of the potential productive power of the capitalist economy. At the same time, these large-scale economies and production also provide the structural foundations of oligopolistic capitalism. If entry barriers and the related price leadership contributed to the breakdown of the competitive Marxist process of accumulation, they would all the more act against the shift that Sweezy rightly considers necessary. Such a change would run against the raison d'etre of capitalism, which sees investment as propelling profits. So we've got finally to the fourth section, which is the summary and conclusions. This is not very long, and we're almost to the end. So hang in there. In Baran and Sweezy, the demarcation line is not between monetary and non-monetary economies, but between capitalist and non-capitalist economic formations. That is, capitalism produces for profits. This is the monetary essence of the system, which in contemporary conditions is an oligopolistic one. In Marxian terms, the relationship between monopoly capital and unused capacity generates a situation whereby a tendency of the surplus value to rise is not incompatible, that is compatible with a fall in the surplus value realized. Now, this is the same thing as saying that because of the effects of gross profit margins on utilization, a shift from wages to profits becomes, in fact, a shift from wages, not to profit, but to wasted, unused capacity. So if we take the above perspective into consideration, we see that the monthly review editors interpret the financial transformations in post-World War II United States capitalism as new ways to absorb the surplus and also as finding means to realize profits through circulation, when the burden of unused capacity sets limits to the rate of accumulation and therefore to the link between investments and profits. The last theme, that is realization through circulation, is a relatively recent one, stemming from the observation made in almost every economic editorial which appeared in Monthly Review in the last 10 years that the financial sector has witnessed an unprecedented expansion in spite of growing stagnation. So they were being beat to death with this one model, but it's not unreasonable given the fact that that's kind of the shape that the data tends to prove this out. On this basis, the conceptual separation is not between the real and the monetary sides of the working of the economy, but between the financial and the productive dimensions of capitalism. So it's not about money. It still has institutional elements. Indeed, while it's impossible to separate between real and monetary activities, with the exception of very crude forms of theorizing such as monetarism, it is extremely valid to ask why and under what conditions financial activities can multiply and prosper amid stagnation in output and investment. Now, although the editors of Monthly Review do not give an analytical answer to the problem, they have the merit of raising a Marxian and Keynesian theme, this is where post-Keynesianism comes in a manner appropriate to contemporary issues. As mentioned in the first section of this paper, the possibility of holding savings in forms which are not conducive to the purchase of capital assets was regarded by Keynes as a major factor in the rise of liquid investment markets and in the volatility of investment itself. In Chapter 16 of the General Theory, the argument is repeated in stronger terms. That is, in a mature economy, well endowed with capital stock, the long-term stability of full employment can be achieved only if investment is carried out even at a near zero marginal efficiency or expected profitability, so as to make capital goods abundant and thereby eliminating capital income. This is the fully automated, luxury communism. From a structural point of view, this line of reasoning is consistent with Sweezy's observations about the necessity of shifting the emphasis of economic activity from those accumulators to the consumers. At the same time, the multiplication of financial instruments can be viewed as expressing forces pushing the economy in an opposite direction to the normative conditions analyzed by Keynes in chapter 16. This validates the entire post-Keynesian, thing. Now, if we interpret the creation of even wider variety of financial instruments as an expansion of the alternative ways in which savings can be held, other than the purchase of capital goods, then we must conclude that Sweezy and Magdoff are on more solid ground than Keynes, since in their approach, the phenomenon is connected with the corporate structure of monopolistic capitalism, such as holding companies and the like. The Marxian theme lies, of course, in the rehabilitation of the notion that there are productive and unproductive sectors in the economy. And we talked about this before. Productive and unproductive are not identical to paid and unpaid. The novelty vis-a-vis Marx is to be found in the argument that the emergence of unproductive activities is a result of a particular stage of capitalist development, a stage in which unused capacity is a chronic phenomenon setting limits to realizing profits through production. Now, the renewed emphasis on the relation between production and finances embodying conflicting elements specific to the advanced stage of capitalism is at present at the conjectural stage only, although this does not diminish the validity of the approach. So, in other words, it's still sketchy, as Baran Sweezy described it. The most noticeable shortcoming lies, in my opinion, that is in Halvey, in the absence of a set of clear hypotheses about the connection between oligopolistic structures, financial expansion, and stagflation. This was the issue in 2008, which was badly solved. It was solved. The can got kicked, but some people should have gone to jail. Let's just put it that way. Magdoff and Sweezy are certainly correct in pointing out that the dynamism of the financial sector has gathered momentum under stagnationist and inflationary conditions. But how are we to establish the causal relations? As a matter of fact, a theoretical interpretation of the rise of corporate finance has been developed by Stendhal. He maintains that the consolidation of profit margins under oligopoly in the presence of a sizable amount of income inelastic savings, that is, dividends and executive salaries, would tend to hamper the accumulation of business capital. Joint stock finance becomes, therefore, the instrument by which finance can be obtained. Yet Stendhal's analysis is entirely oriented towards the explanation of the factors weakening accumulation and engendering stagnation, and it does not link up with hypotheses about inflation. Since we believe that Magdoff and Sweezy's decisions to locate the phenomenon in the context of stagnation is of paramount importance, we suggest that the identification of consistent causal relation should become the subject of the theoretical research of those who appreciate the validity of the monthly review people. The writings of Baran Sweezy and Magdoff, integrated with the contribution of Kalecki, Stendhal, and Silos Labini, represent the basic framework for an analysis of modern capitalism. Now, conceptualizing historical phenomena is never a fully self-contained process, and this is why gaps and shady areas are bound to arise. Yet this is preferable to axiomatic theorizing. Neoclassicism is very axiomatic, where the laboratory of economics, i.e. history, disappears altogether. This entire field of experimental economics that does a lot of axiomatic theorizing. And it's all very interesting, but it's ahistorical in that sense. Their approach has the invaluable merit of preventing the transformation of economic theory into a set of technocratic exercises. In this paper, we've elected to put the question of structural maturity at the center of attention because it constitutes the point of convergence between Keynes, Sweezy, and Kalecki. Note that other folks have made this, that's why we're in post-Keynesianism, where there's a bunch of other ideas, some of which are still important. In this context, the oligopolistic basis of monopolistic capitalism highlights the crucial differences between accumulation and the reserve army of Marxian competition and excess capacity and unemployment during the age of monopoly capital. Okay, I know you can't remember any of the, if you can read and sort of grok this closing thing, this is kind of this is the précis of the whole deal. And you know, it is consonant with the analysis that Michael Hudson did of the reasons for the 2008 failure. Not that it explains it, but it gives you this underlying thing about, well, what's the rest of the economy doing while these, banksters are at work? So Hudson gives you the details, but you can see the larger structural condition there is that the structure of a capitalist economy, particularly in the United States, is highly inefficient, complicated, oligopolistic. The MIC, the military industrial complex, is an oligopolistic body. It is aided by pork barreling by the Congress, for example, in terms of allocating stuff, procurement. It's why we manage some rockets in Huntsville, Alabama, why we have some launches done from Texas in a variety of both public and private contexts, why all our military stuff comes out of Vandenberg in California. Lots of different things are going on. So anyway, now I am going to, as demanded, is to not stop the share and stop the if I can, I have to stop the live stream first, which is what I'm going to try and do.